My family had a very strong connection with Nyugat because my grandfather was a playwright, very successful, named Ferenc Molnár, known abroad as well. And my father was a poet who married the daughter of Ferenc Molnár. Molnár was a kind of bourgeois playwright writing for the general public, and his comedies were very popular, and he very soon after he started in 1899 in Budapest. There was a curious thing. Foreign theater companies came to Hungary and performed in the Vígszínház, in the comedy theater. Budapest's population was so mixed before the First World War. There were Italians, there were Germans, that it was worthwhile to have Italian and German companies coming to Hungary and perform whatever they wanted, Shakespeare, not entirely German or Italian plays. And it happened that when my grandfather's second comedy was on, called Az Ördög, the Devil, an Italian troupe was just about having 4 or 5 evenings in the comedy theater performing Shakespeare, and even those who didn't speak Italian went to see, because there's a very famous Italian actor of the time, Zacconi, and Zacconi was doing Hamlet. So Zacconi, just for fun, sat in on the following day to see what my grandfather done and what was this comedy like. And someone was sitting next to him, whispering sort of synchron translation all the time into his ear. And he saw this character, the devil, and he said, "This is such a good role. I want to play this. Let's have this play translated." And someone, during the night, translated it into German, and then someone else from the German into Italian, and Zacconi took it around the world, and from one day to the other, Ferenc Molnár became an internationally known playwright in Europe, and later in America as well. Now, in 1908, this magazine, The West, was started, and with the money of some millionaire industrialists who liked to help coming up writers. And of course, Molnár was asked to send in some manuscripts. He usually sent in sort of 1 or 2 acts from his new plays. And after a while, he thought that is not quite his cup of tea, this Nyugat, this is too modernistic, and he dropped out. But that was the time when my father became quite a well-known poet, and the editor, co-editor of Nyugat, Mihály Babics, was looking for young talents. So the first time a poem was published by my father in Nyugat was the time when he was only 18. Actually, the title of the poem was We 18-Year-Olds. Later, he never included it in any of his published volumes because he didn't think that was his strongest poem. But as my father was born in 1899, it must have been 1899 plus 18, what is it? My mathematics is very bad. It must have been 1917, during the First World War, when Babics was a pacifist Catholic poet. My father was a curious animal because he was a Catholic poet of Jewish origin. He became fascinated by Catholic philosophy while in a very good school in Budapest, and he was known as an angelic a Catholic poet, but when 1944 and the Holocaust came about, Adolf Hitler didn't quite appreciate the fact that he was supposed to be Christian, and because of his Jewish origin, he was killed in a concentration camp. So he, my father, György Sárközi, who married the daughter of the famous playwright Ferenc Molnár, was a stronger figure in the history of Nyugat than his father-in-law was. And actually he contributed a great deal, and also criticism and articles and whatever, and he became one of the best known of the Nyugat's so-called silver period, because the Nyugat had a golden period from the beginning, from 1908 until something like 1920, and then came the youngsters who created the silver period. And now what we are trying to do here in the Hungarian Institute, we are trying to include both periods, the pre-First World War period, the so-called Belle Epoque, which is referred to in Hungarian as the régi szép békeidők, the good old peace years, when everything was wonderful and Hungary was a coming up country with tremendous tourist industry. Everybody came to Hungary. Very interesting, there's a man called John Lukács, a historian, a very old man now. He lives in the United States, a university professor, and he wrote a fascinating book called Budapest 1900. It's available in English and Hungarian. And what he says there is that first, during the Belle Epoque, that before the First World War, people flocked to Budapest because it was a very modern city. There was electric lighting on the boulevards, and of course, the first underground railway on the continent, older than the Paris metro, and the second only after the London metro, which is not on the continent, but on this curious island called Great Britain. Well, it rattled there, admittedly, only under the surface, and it's still there. And everybody came to see what a modern city Budapest was. And of course, during the millennium, when Hungary was celebrating 1,000 years of nationhood in 1886, fantastic new buildings came up, and statues on the squares. I mean, Franz Josef, who was King of Hungary and Emperor of Austria, gave a huge sum so that 6 bronze statues could have been set up of famous Hungarian kings, and of course on the Hero Square, that huge panopticon of Hungarian kings emerged, and the Parliament building, which is very impressive indeed, one of the largest in Europe, modeled on Westminster Palace by the Thames. This is neo-Gothic and the Hungarian is more neo-Baroque, but it's getting prettier and prettier all the time. I hear that, I haven't been back to Budapest this year yet, that in front of the Parliament building they recreated the pre-war park and statues and everything as it was. Now, the First World War ruined everything. My grandfather was a war correspondent. He wore an armband saying press and went to war. He was a very much of a coward, so he never went to the first lines, the front lines, but sat sort of 20 miles behind the front lines in a cafe or an inn or a pub, chatting with the officers. My grandmother, his divorced wife, Margit Vécé, was the first lady war correspondent in Europe. She was riding around on a horse on horseback. The bullets were sort of whizzing past her head. And she was always there where the action was. And she wrote some very boring reviews of what she saw, while my grandfather, sitting and chatting with the army officers back a good way behind the front line, had the most marvelous stories written down. And he published a very thick volume, My War Diary. And his stories were so good that the enemy papers, the British Daily Mail and other sort of boulevard papers, printed my grandfather's war stories, anecdotes, because they were so amusing. He had a very good eye to pick up the most interesting and amusing things. And for example, just one short thing. 2 little Hungarian soldiers got lost during the war after a battle, disappeared, and everybody was anxious that what happened to them. Are they dead? Are they lying in a gutter somewhere covered in blood, or what happened to them? And after 3 years, the 2 little soldiers, unshaved and very dirty, covered in mud, came along and they said, "We found our way back to the camp." And wonderful. And how did you find your way back? This is one of my grandfather's stories in his book. So, well, we had this map with us, and we had followed the map all the way, and we came back to the camp without any trouble. And they showed the map from a school atlas, the county Borsod, which was nothing like the Polish lines what they were in Galicia at the time, but they just followed it. So there are little amusing war stories which are, in a way, comical but sort of typical, and show the tragedy and the comedy at the same time. But this was a book which was very popular, and as I read it recently, because I had to use it for a documentary film, I found out that this huge enthusiasm that, oh, you dirty Serbian dogs, we will show you, Kuća Serbia, we will beat you to pulp, and you will see what our army is like, our wonderful hussars on horseback. Hussars on horseback were machine gunned down on the first day. Anyway, my grandfather soon realized that this war is lost. And it is not all sort of hooray optimism and how wonderful to beat the Serbians, but we are going to lose this war. And there were so many war wounded and so much blood, and there was gas attacks in the First World War, and everybody got gassed. It went on their lungs. They became blind. There are so many people crippled by the war. After the war, I mean, Georg Gross, the German graphic artist, has these wonderful drawings of Berlin after the war, the rich coming out of the big Mercedes cars with fat cigars and beautiful girls on their arms, and on the corner stands this guy coming from the war, still in his uniform, with one leg lost, and then the sign on his chest, "I'm blind," dark glasses. So it was a very tragic war. And then my grandfather, Ferenc Molnár, was asked to write a play about the war. And he first refused, and then he wrote a play called Fehér Felhő, the White Cloud, which is now going to be shown this year in the Hungarian National Theatre. And I hope that the new director, chief producer, Attila Vinyánszky, will do something out of it, because it's a play which is, in my judgment, a bit too sentimental. It's not about, here we come winning the war. The story is that a white cloud comes rather low on a day above the village. And the village children from the highest spot, from a hill, can climb onto the clouds, and it takes them up to heavens. And there they meet their fathers, who are all war dead. There they are, lying on the ground with terrible wounds and blood, and they are all dead. They are up in the other world, and they talk to them. And this play, all right, it's rather sentimental, and it's a tear-jerker, and I don't think it's ever so good, unless they do it very specially and very well. I have doubts about it. But probably they will. I don't want to spoil their production in advance. I'm sure they will do something clever with it. But what shows that during the First World War, a lot of agricultural proletarian soldiers who... Hungary was an agricultural country, more than an industrial country. They were the ones, the gun fodder. They were sent out to the first lines to die, and they died for the land of the country which they didn't own, because they didn't even have a smallhold. They had no land. And that's a tremendous social message. So, all right, in this Hungarian Institute, we are now showing what flourishing art life there was in Hungary before the war. We are showing how wonderful our war artists were, who were serving with the press corps, painters, photographers, excellent photographers, and graphic artists. Just to mention one, the Baron Mednyánszky, who is already 62 years old. László Mednyánszky, an aristocrat, a very good painter, insisted that he wants to go out with the troops and sketch the dead horses and the soldiers sitting dead tired on the roadside, bandages with blood coming through, and he done some tremendous drawings. So the idea is, now I know that the British War Museum is presently closed for renovation or whatever, but the war lasted 4 years, and this is just 2014, so there is another 4 years while we can do something with the First War anniversary, and perhaps with the end of the Great War, as they call it in Britain. And there should be an exhibition of war artists international, the British war artists, the Hungarian war artists, the Austrians, the Germans, the Italians. I'm sure it would make a wonderful exhibition, and they could use some of the stuff that they gathered here in the Hungarian Institute.